Gleich kommt das Falter-Radio. Vorher gibt es noch Werbung. Sie hilft, unsere journalistische Arbeit zu finanzieren.
Gebt euch Kitschmas Deluxe mit dem schillernden Hua Weihnachtsspecial von Bob. 30 GB um 17,90 € und gratis Huawei P30 Lite. Ho, ho, hol's dir auf Bob.at. Das ist
Falter-Radio, der Podcast mit Raimund Löw.
Sehr herzlich willkommen, meine Damen und Herren, zum zweiten Teil des Falter-Radios für Samstag, den 23.11.2019. Im ersten Teil hörten Sie die Anklagerede der amerikanischen Ökonomin und ehemaligen Harvard-Professorin Shoshana Zuboff gegen die Geschäfte von Google, Facebook und Co. mit unseren Daten. Seit Sand im Getriebe mit diesem Aufruf gegen die Internetkonzerne in der Frankfurter Allgemeinen Zeitung ist die amerikanische Ökonomin Shoshana Zuboff bereits 2013 hervorgetreten. In ihrer Rede im Wiener Stadtgespräch am 14. November in Wien hat Zuboff ihre Systemkritik präzisiert. In diesem zweiten Teil hören Sie das Gespräch, das Falter-Herausgeber Armin Thurnher mit der rebellischen Denkerin geführt hat.
And maybe allow me to start with a few personal questions, especially since you started talking about fire so impressively. Our home is on fire. Having read your book and a few interviews about your book, fire also played a role in your writing this book, sort of a starting point, if I may say so. Namely your house burning down completely. And after that, you decided to write this book. How did this come about exactly? Can you tell us some more?
Well, I actually began, working on these ideas long before the house burned down. Our house was struck by lightning in what turned out to be a very vicious, exceptionally vicious, violent thunderstorm, which, when my daughter turned to researching the thunder that brought down our home, my daughter was a climate activist, and she was 16 at the time, and she quickly discovered that where we live, in a state called Maine, in the northern part of the United States, this is an area that is extremely prone to destructive lightning. It has to do with ratios of coastline to land mass, and that indeed the lightning that took our home was a feature of global warming in our state. I had these ideas. I've been working on these themes for a very long time, Armin. In a way, since 1978.
Was it a motivation to become economist, even, or to see these things from the point of an economist, or was it different? Was it your work as an economist that's got you in touch with this
I'm not
subject?
an economist. Did I tell you that?
Well, one assumes when you teach. Well, I've written different descriptions of psychology, social psychology, economy.
Yes, I have that kind of, the man in the hat without the face. I have a little bit of that quality.
But you were teaching at Harvard Business School, as you just said.
Yes, but, there's more to business than economics.
Okay.
As we've just discussed. No, I'm not an economist by training. I certainly read economics. I'm a social scientist by training, and psychology, social psychology, history. But I've been working on these themes for a long time, and specifically the themes in this book, I first started drafting around 2007. Our home burned down in 2009, and everything was gone. Everything was gone, and all my scholarly work was gone, but everything was gone. So
you didn't keep it in the cloud?
Well, strangely enough, in those days where we lived in the country, that wasn't yet an option.
No?
No. I had many backups, many different computers, many backups, but of course they were all gone. So the point is that, this is something that I'll tell you in case it ever becomes useful for somebody sitting in this room or all those other rooms out there. So after the fire, all the data was gone. I'd been out in the field and talking to entrepreneurs and executives and startups and learning about what I would eventually call surveillance capitalism. And so all the data was gone. But I noticed when all the data was gone, the ideas themselves burned even more clearly. All I had left was what was in my head. That's all I had left. Not a single piece of paper survived, or a disk or computer. But what was in my head became so clear. At that time, I thought I would probably never write again. But obviously, that was not true. So the ideas came very clearly, and eventually, we were able to, rebuild a home and settle our children, and then I went back to work, and then I never looked up again.
And you talk to a lot of people also from the big tech companies and so forth, and you had to guarantee them anonymity in part, so they would speak to you. Was that difficult to get information from them? Were they reluctant to speak to you? How did you do that?
No, it wasn't difficult at all. I interviewed about 52 data scientists in the course of doing this work. And that was especially important early on. What I said to you at the beginning, how we count on leaked documents and whistleblowers. There's there are rhetorics that come out of the tech companies and the leading surveillance capitalists that are engineered to keep us ignorant, engineered to obfuscate what's really going on. And these are carefully crafted. It's not just off the cuff. So you have to really dig and put all kinds of pieces together in order to figure out, how can they be saying this when I believe they're actually doing this, and how do I create that line to connect in between and have the facts. So in doing that early work and being able to identify the foundational mechanisms of surveillance capitalism, its methodologies, ultimately moving on to the economic imperatives, those conversations were essential.
And did you ever get any pressure? I mean, these companies are very anxious about keeping their secrets, as you said, and that one knows. And did they realize what you were doing or what you were up to? And did you feel any pressure from them?
No.
No?
No, I mean, I don't know that anybody knew what I was working on. My house had burned down. I didn't work for. It wasn't publishing. I think some people thought maybe I was dead. But this book, if you have, this is the paperback. It's published in the UK, but the hardcover is quite hefty.
Very unusual thing, excuse me, about this book was it came out in German before it came out in English. So that also made me think, how did that happen? It hardly ever happens with any book.
Hardly ever happens.
Yeah.
But the point is that once I was writing, it took a really long time. I mean, I began writing in earnest in 2011. The book was published in 2019. So you have some idea, and that was just to produce this manuscript. So it was a long time. I was not in the public eye at all. I wasn't trying to be. The only thing I was doing was I was publishing in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung.
That's what I was going to ask you about. It was also very strange because you didn't publish in the New York Times or any of those papers.
No, I was publishing in Germany.
And how did that come about? Was that Frank Schirmacher?
That was Frank Schirmacher. Dear Frank.
He was here too a few years ago.
I'm
sat in your chair.
Yes, yeah. some of you, I'm sure, know him or know him by reputation. Brilliant man. So one day he wrote to me. It was 2012. Just wrote to me, an email or something, and asked me. He had read some of my early work and asked me how is it that you were so prophetic. So I thought, well, this must be a very intelligent man. I'll have to write back to him. I never looked him up or who he was or what his role in society was. I don't like to do that unless it's absolutely necessary. I like to go on the exchange. And so we had a wonderful correspondence for quite a long time.
And you published a few articles. I read them and I was amazed, and I thought you must be a big star in the United States. But then I looked it up and I didn't see that much around in papers, that much of a presence. You were publishing in German.
That was during my quiet period. One becomes a star on and off in one's career. And if one has any brains, one doesn't take it too seriously.
it will pass.
So I wanted to write in Germany because in 2013 is when I published my first piece in the FATS. And at that time I believed that Germany was the front line. And if anything was going to happen in this field, it would happen first in Germany. Not in the least because of the discussion that I've just introduced, the idea that, here's a people that has been traumatized by totalitarianism, and they do not take democracy for granted. And it's obviously acutely true in Germany, but it's true throughout Europe in a way that is simply different in the United States.
There's one thing that I was thinking about when you held your speech that you didn't mention, but you mentioned it in your book, is the influence of 9/11 on that decision that the FTC didn't take, after all, that they were about to take, the regulation they were about to take. They sort of threw it away, threw it in the basket after 9/11, and a completely new stage started under the impression of cooperating with CIA and the state. Could you describe that a little bit?
Well, you're absolutely right. There is a line to be drawn from that Federal Trade Commission discussion that I reported to you right to 9/11. Because that was 1997, 98, 99, 2000, 2001. During those years, the commissioners finally did persuade themselves that the tech sector would not be able to self-regulate, and that comprehensive federal privacy legislation would be required. They began circulating proposals what this legislation might look like. And on September 10th, 2001, these legislative proposals were circulating in the Congress. And the discussion, when it came to the internet, the discussion in Congress was on privacy. 24 hours later, after 9/11, from those who were there on Capitol Hill at the time, the report is that the discussion changed 180 degrees in those 24 hours. From privacy now to total information awareness. An obsession with how do we know? Where's the threat? Who's the threat? How do we find out? And they understood at that time that these fledgling companies, they were not full-blown surveillance capitalists yet. Google was still a tiny company. But they understood that these capabilities were already starting to be created. agencies like the NSA were already feeling jealous of some of the capabilities that they saw coming out of the young Google.
Then let me ask in between, or maybe let me tell people how we plan to go ahead with this evening. We will talk for about another half hour here at the longest, and then you will have a chance to pose your questions. Google at that time wasn't even a surveillance capitalist enterprise in your sense. Google was still sort of looking for its aim, and they hadn't even decided to bet on advertising. Is that correct?
Yes.
They just hadn't found the key yet. And what you called before was the dot-com bubble, but it wasn't the dot-com bubble alone. Maybe it was a combination of this 9/11 thing and the bursting dot-com bubble that they decided to go commercial and to sell what you would call the behavioral surplus. Is that right?
Yes.
That's what they did around 2001, 2002.
2000, 2001 was this period of discovery. Their own investors were threatening to pull out, even though they were the smartest guys in the room, they had the best search engine. And here's the critical point. They had rejected advertising before this because it would disfigure search and it would disfigure the internet. Now they came back to advertising, discovering that they had leftover data, behavioral traces everywhere, called digital exhaust, and that these data contained rich predictive signals. So now the edict within the company was, we're going to pull all these data together, we're going to double down on analysis and prediction, and we're going to figure out how we match users with ads. That's what became the micro-targeting that became so successful. You know, I walked you through a little bit of the logic, the idea that we start with the unilateral claiming of human experience and we end in these human futures markets beginning with online targeted advertising. But here's what I didn't tell you. Between the year 2000, when emergency set in, and the year 2004, when Google went public, which was the first time we got a look into how it was faring with this new logic, because when they went public, they had to publish their IPO documents. In those few years, their revenue line increased by 3,590%. That's a big number. That's what I call the surveillance dividend. That reset the bar for investment, first in Silicon Valley, but now this is moving through our economies. So we've got, for example, the head of Ford Motor in a kind of perfect circle of paradox, Ford Motor being the birthplace of mass production, 20th century capitalism. Here in the Ford Motor Company, where the CEO is facing a global slump in auto sales, what would Henry Ford do? Well, I kind of think that Henry Ford would probably say, let's figure out how to invent a car that people are actually going to want to buy again. I know, how about a car that doesn't burn carbon, that's totally affordable by anybody who wants one? That's not what the CEO of Ford is saying. He's saying, we have 100 million people driving in Ford vehicles. Let's stream data from all of these people. Let's combine it with the data we have from the Ford credit system, where we already know everything about you. With these data flows, he says, we will be equal to the Facebook and the Googles. Who would not want to invest in us? Ford Motor chasing the surveillance dividend. This is what's moving through our economies.
So you say we don't have cars anymore, we have streaming bubbles rolling around in the streets.
He calls it, it's not cars anymore, as you say, Armin. It's a transportation operating system.
It's great.
I couldn't make it up.
What's also fascinating about this new class of capitalists is the recklessness with which they sort of, like, you compare it to the conquistadores. They just state something and they state it as the truth, and the truth becomes reality just because they stated it. Just like Cortes or Columbus declared, this is our land, this is land of the Spanish queen, so it belongs to us. And they declare Google, like, I don't know, Eric Schmidt or Larry Page, I forget. How can Google respond to any laws that were made before the internet age?
That was Mr. Page who said, how can they expect us laws that were written before the internet was invented? Think about that.
But the interesting thing is it works. And they act lawless, they act outside of the law, and they cannot be moved into the law. Or do you think this is changing slowly?
Well, I think it's a little bit worse than that. I think it's not only that they act outside of the law and are willing to take whatever comes and just, evade it, fight it, bamboozle us into confusion. I think it's more the case that they're not exactly acting illegally. This is my point about unprecedented power. When something is unprecedented, it's never happened before. And we don't have laws to protect us from things that have never happened. This is how, for example, we didn't start out with laws that protected freedom of speech. Everybody is born being able to speak. And you say, Mama, it's too hot. Come here. Whatever you want to say. And you don't need a law to protect your speech. You need a law when society becomes so complex that suddenly the freedom of speech can be threatened. That's a level of political evolution, of political complexity, where we finally invent laws to protect speech. Speech existed before laws to protect speech. And this is where we are now.
It's a question of power relations.
We don't have laws to protect us from their unprecedented mechanisms. That I can walk down the street and they can take my face and I don't know it. And they use it for facial recognition training systems. And those training systems grow in volume and complexity. They're supposed to be, they tell us they're used only for academics.
Doesn't break any law.
It doesn't break any law. Next thing we know, they're being sold to military divisions in our own societies, but also in China. Next thing we know, they're going to the Chinese military division that is imprisoning the Uyghurs in an open-air prison that doesn't require walls because it has facial recognition systems instead. We have contributed to that with our unprotected faces.
So, do you think politicians are, rhetorical questions, do you think politicians are informed enough to even bring about the necessary laws?
Look, we all know the answer to that. And yes, it is kind of a tragic comic kind of situation for us, isn't it?
But it's more tragic than comic.
But it's more tragic than comic. This is why I'm here, to talk with you. talk with all of you. Because lawmakers do not stand alone. They depend upon us. They depend upon us demanding the protections that are our right as democratic citizens. They need us to give them strength, to make them bold. They need us to give them cover. They need us to demand that they act. Let me just say on our lawmakers' behalf, may I? Mm-hmm. They have been intimidated in 3 ways, at least. I'll just name 3 big ones. Number 1, it has been pounded into them that tech is fast, surveillance capitalism is fast and innovative. Democracy is slow, and democracy will get in the way of innovation. This is a complete crock of falsehood. This is utterly untrue. You know who invented this idea? It goes back to the late 19th century. J.P. Morgan, the Gilded Age industrialist, who later we decided to call him a robber. After we made laws, we decided to call him a robber baron. But before that, he was just a really rich, powerful guy. He said, democracy will always get in the way of prosperity. You can't get in the way of business. He said, we don't need any laws. We have enough laws. We have the law of supply and demand, and we have the law of survival of the fittest. We don't need any more laws. The surveillance capitalists simply adapted these same silly arguments, precisely tailored to intimidate democratic officials. Democracy is slow. Guess what? Slow is good. Slow means you got on your coats tonight and you came out here. That takes time. You came out here to listen and to talk and debate. That takes time. To think, to learn, to interact. These things take time. That's what makes it democracy. We have to flip this back to be proud of democracy, to be proud that it's a bit slow, because that's what keeps us strong. And we have to demand of our lawmakers that they too have courage.
Okay, that's the power of the argument. Deliberation takes time, it has to be slow. But at the same time, all politicians depend on social media, depend on platform capitalism for their own political marketing. It's impossible to tell them to get off. How do you argue with people like that? It's a question of power.
So, they do depend on the micro-targeting that comes now through the platforms, just as Cambridge Analytica did, and in very similar ways. So that is going to have to stop, at least in the way it currently exists. Here's the thing. I am not making an argument against data. I am not making an argument against a digital future. I am making an argument that says it must be a human future first. It must be a digital future that comes under democratic governance. If I'm going to give my face, I decide. It happens under my authority as a democratic citizen. It is my right to decide, if I give over my experience, what becomes data, how those data are shared, and to what purpose. These are my rights. So there is a scenario where, for example, you know, we talked about this a little bit before, Armin. You know, how does a business use data about its customers in a way that is not surveillance capitalism? Completely legitimate. As a business, I want data about my customers so I can improve my product and improve my service. That's it. This is the road we were on before surveillance capitalism. This is a road that all we need to do is pick up that thread. When it comes to politics, the same principles exist. You know, people can opt into, I belong to a political party, I'm happy for them to use my data so that all of this stuff now becomes transparent. I opt in, I want to make a contribution, and everything that they're doing is transparent, so I know exactly what's going on. In the health regime, which we mentioned right at the beginning, let's say I have a cancer. I could choose to want to contribute my health data to a group that is working on cancer treatments, cancer remedies, right? Because this is the purpose to which I want to contribute. It's all done transparently, you know, with reciprocity and mutual authority and engagement. It's no longer surveillance capitalism.
Are there any logistic initiatives that you know about that formulate laws into the point in this direction, at least? I mean, there are some struggles in the States, Elizabeth Warren against Facebook, but that seems rather superficial on the level, are you allowed to lie in political ads or not?
Yeah.
But are you aware of any serious legal initiatives?
There are serious legal initiatives. And there is no question in my mind that we are at the beginning of a new wave. In the 10 days before I left for Berlin, there were two important new pieces of legislation that were introduced in Washington, one in the Senate, one in the House. The House was a comprehensive new bill for federal privacy legislation, just as was being proposed back in 2001. But now it's far more dramatic than what was even being proposed back then. It's a bill introduced by the two congresswomen who actually represent Silicon Valley. And the aim of this bill is to shift the whole framework of online privacy from the clearly bogus notice and consent regime that still dominates to a new framework based on human rights, explicitly named human rights, including the right to autonomy, right? And so this is a big step forward in US law. It would also establish a federal privacy agency with criminal authority, law enforcement authority, subpoena authority, something that would really have teeth. Another piece of legislation was introduced in the Senate that would essentially make filter bubbles, as we know them, illegal. If a company like Facebook was going to have your news feed driven by filter bubble algorithms, it would also have to show you the same news feed in a strictly chronological logic.
Maybe we should explain filter bubbles. They're driven by algorithms, and they sort of favor extremist positions on both sides.
Filter bubbles are just like what I described to you when we talk about the teenagers and how they could be targeted, and the Chris Wiley, the idea that we're targeting your inner demons. So filter bubbles are folks who get enough of an insight into who you are, what you're about, what your inner demons are all about, that they send you content that will specifically engage your hot buttons. And so you engage with that, and that becomes a kind of self-reinforcing cycle of greater intensity, and you stop seeing any information that challenges your biases. You're just getting information that engages your biases. Now, why would that be? Because that increases engagement. And every single second you spend engaged, cha-ching, you know, that's more data flowing into supply chains, right? More data flowing into supply chains means better predictions. Better predictions is more lucrative, and that's revenue for surveillance capitalists.
Do you think it's possible to maintain this kind of tech business under capitalist principles? Is there a good capitalism that's not a surveillance capitalism, or aren't these structures that are too big, you know, sort of spanning all of humanity, or at least all of democratic humanity, that they have to be taken out of this profit system and be put into a kind of public service system? In other words, dispossession of Mark Zuckerberg.
I think that right now we have a monolithic system. Surveillance capitalism owns and operates the internet. This is a monolithic system. And we're engaged in it essentially because we have no choice, called the dictatorship of no alternatives. All right. We don't have to replace this monolithic system with another monolith. I think there's massive opportunity for public systems, not state systems, but public systems that are under democratic governance, that, for example, perhaps oversee social media or oversee one version of social media, oversee other kinds of services. There's also opportunities for commercial systems.
But you think social media shouldn't be commercial systems?
No, I'm not saying that there's one answer. I think, you know, the big opportunity here is for emergent solutions. People will figure out how to do social media. You know, social media, it does not have to be a massive monolith. We can have different solutions for social media. We can have one platform with different entities riding on that platform and offering different ways of using and engaging with that platform. So the very structure of this whole thing literally can shift. So we can have public and commercial systems both riding the same pipes and the same networks, the same platform, and offering different experiences, different solutions, different quid pro quos. Some may be subscription. Some may be for free. Some may be publicly subsidized. Others may find their model in a different, having a product or a service to actually sell.
And how are we going to solve the problem that we're in the age of in a new age of propaganda, so to speak? By, you know, you look at important elections or votes like Brexit, for example, or Trump, and the role that Cambridge Analytica played in it. And how can we assure ourselves that things like that don't happen?
Look,
because this is going at the root of democracy, isn't it?
I understand. There's only one answer for that question. It's through politics. It's through democracy. That's why I read you these statements in 1997. These problems are not going to solve themselves. That time, if it ever existed, has long passed. This is now a matter for law, for democratic governance. It is an intolerable situation that we have companies that have taken so much, that have created these unprecedented asymmetries of knowledge and power, unimpeded by law, and are beholding to nothing but themselves. There is no democratic oversight. There is no democratic governance. We have no say. Facebook wants to create its own courts and its own financial systems. Google wants to own your body, your car, your home, your city, without impediment. Have you followed what the people of Toronto have done to fight the Google city in Toronto? You should, because that is an example of good, slow democracy, where so far the citizens of Toronto have been successful in slowing Google's bid to unilaterally take a huge part of the Toronto waterfront and turn it into a place which, according to their own documents, sounds a lot like the Chinese social credit system, rewarding and punishing people based on how much data they share and how they behave.
So maybe this is an example we should mention here, because Vienna, with all its socialist tradition, prides itself in being a smart city or becoming a smart city. What do you think about the title of a smart city?
Look, do you remember I talked to you about economies of action? Economies of scale. We get a lot of data. Economies of scope. We get varieties of data. Economies of action. Never heard of that one before. That means, how do we use the digital to actually to produce a lot of action efficiently? And the action that we choose. How do we know about economies of action? Because it's something new, unprecedented. The companies have experimented with these new capabilities, often hiding in plain sight. Number one, Facebook's what they called their massive scale contagion experiments, were experiments in how to manipulate action at scale through subliminal cues and online social comparison dynamics. They were successful. Number two, the game Pokemon Go. Anybody in this room play Pokemon Go? Come on. I know that there is more than two honest young women in this room who played Pokemon Go. You probably didn't know that Pokemon Go was incubated for many years at Google. Developed at Google by the same man who brought Street View, who brought Google Earth, a man named John Hanke who spent his life filling Google's supply chains with behavioral data.
Was there a relation with the CIA too, just at this point?
His original invention was called Keyhole, invested in by the CIA, purchased from the CIA by Google, renamed Google Earth. A man with a long pedigree in surveillance capitalism who architected Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go learned how to herd populations and individuals through the city streets to the establishments that were paying the game for guaranteed footfall. Footfall, that means your feet on the floor in their shops and restaurants. McDonald's, Starbucks, Joe's Pizza. Your feet on the floor in their shops is the same as click-through. Your fingers clicking through on their websites. Same structure, human futures markets. From Facebook's social contagion to Pokemon Go, we move to the city as the next experimental zone. The smart city is finally where the mechanisms and methods meet real life. Finally, to substitute democratic governance with computational governance. But this is computational governance owned and operated by private capital, private surveillance capital, so that how we behave vis-a-vis our transportation systems, our housing systems, our retail systems, where we eat, where we walk, what we do, all of these things are maximized for their commercial outcomes. In just the day before the Toronto officials issued their first set of decisions, where they ended up curtailing the Google proposals, just that day before, the Globe and Mail broke a story. This is right up your alley, Armin. Mm-hmm. You need to write about this for Vienna. They broke a story where they found these 2016 documents authored by Alphabet, Google, Sidewalk Labs, telling their vision for their smart city. And this is where they detailed how they're going to give companies and individuals reputation scores based on how they behave, and give them access or deny them access to goods and services based on their reputation scores. How they're going to create a class structure. The more data you give, the more you are included in the wondrous new services and products that they're offering. And if you choose to be anonymous, you are excluded from the services. The security services, the energy efficiency services, the retail services, the transportation services. Anonymous means you are excluded. This is what they write about. This is the story that the Globe and Mail broke. I presume it had some influence, although I'm sure that the key decisions were already made. This is what, so, go to Barcelona. In Barcelona, under the last 5 years of leadership of Francesca Bria, who was the chief technology officer of Barcelona, they've created an alternative in Barcelona. In Barcelona, they say, we deserve a smart city. We deserve data to improve our city, improve our quality of life, but it must be the citizens' data. It must come under democratic authority. Solidarity of democracy, solidarity of citizens. These are the structures that will decide and control data in our smart city. Barcelona is not alone. Montreal is working in this direction. There are other cities too. If this is what you have to study in Vienna, the smart city is a siren song. You know, the sirens that grabbed Odysseus. You need to study the alternatives. Have a smart city, but let it be your city first. This is essential.
It's not obvious. It's your chance to ask questions. There are microphones. Please just give me signs, and here's a raised arm. First row. Okay. No, there's one before you, and then you.
Yeah, hello. My name is Sarah Spiekermann, and I wanted to ask you one question. You are saying that these companies, they are selling certainty to us. And in Austria, we are now in a situation where companies are selling this certainty to governments. Governmental institutions, our employment service, for instance, is buying analytical services to calculate whether people are still being getting training, as you said, education to improve their skills. At the same time, you say politics should save us. What is your opinion on such a movement?
So this is a system which is typical of algorithmic decision-making, right? It collects a lot of data from the past. It turns it into decision rules. And then it applies those decision rules to the present and the future. Now, without saying anything more, what is the obvious flaw in such systems? The obvious flaw is that all you do is create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right? So, You know, the first time I ever learned about these systems, I was going to try and think how old I was, but I think I might not mention that part. But I will say it was 1982. I was in a pulp mill looking at advanced algorithmic systems in 1982 in a pulp mill. I was researching my first book. And I didn't know what algorithms were, so I asked them to explain to me what is an algorithm. And they explained it, and I thought about it for a minute, and I wrote something down in my notebook that day that I never forgot. I wrote an equation, and that equation was, this is Zuboff thinking, algorithms equal institutions. In other words, from what they explained to me, I concluded that they took past behavior, they put it into mathematical logic, they put it in the computer, and they institutionalized it for all time. So what was past became forever. Algorithms are institutions. I have not yet found a reason to change my mind about this, although there is a field about machine learning, and we could talk about that. The point is that the system that Sarah is referring to is a perfect example of this. We take data about people, you know, for example, people who have had disabilities, or people, women who have young children or babies. And we create a system that predicts employment difficulties, that then puts them in a category, that determines what kind of resources they get. And what this leaves out is all the dynamism of human life. All the dynamism of human life. People's lives change. The circumstances of their lives change. Right? And there's no room for that dynamism here. Plus people who weren't in a category that should be in a category, people who are in a category that should no longer be in a category. So what does this all mean at its essence? The crazy irony of all of this is that what do we know about the things that really help people get employed? There are things that we actually know about that. We know that what helps people get employed are networks of other people. People help people get employed. That's not accounted for in this system. When we take these systems, whether it's in education, which is another very pernicious area where these systems are being deployed, including in our children's classrooms, we know the single most important variable in what makes our children's education successful. Do you know what that variable is? One variable. What's the variable? What? The teacher. Last time I looked, the teacher was still a human. In virtually every country, every piece of research shows the biggest success in education is most correlated with one factor, the teacher. A teacher who thought I was special. That's what makes our kids successful. So the point is here that where we really need to go are, data that help support the human beings that are the key to the success in most of these systems that have anything to do with social outcomes. And yet it's a kind of self-loathing where we keep choosing the computer over ourselves, the digital over the human. It's a kind of rejection of ourselves that's just crazy. So we need both. We need both. And so, back to your question, Sarah. What do we do about democracy if democracy is enthralled with algorithmic systems? And this is why I said, Sarah, this is why I said that Our lawmakers cannot do it alone. We need to be mobilized. This is a time for a new movement. We are not just users. They call us users. It's just some anonymous category. We are not just users. We are democratic citizens with shared social, political, psychological, as well as economic interests. We need to be mobilizing. We need new movements. This is what this new century is about now. Epistemic inequality. If we are to have epistemic rights and epistemic justice, mobilization will be essential.
Christoph von Hohenstein, I couldn't agree more. I have two questions nevertheless. The first question is, what do you expect the European Union to do to kind of fight surveillance capitalism? And the second one is maybe a little bit more provocative. You mentioned that your daughter is a climate activist. Do we need digital surveillance in order to nudge us, to convince us to way better care for our climate?
Okay, so by that, do you mean, do we need the data? Oh, I see. You mean to control us. I see what you mean, yeah. Okay. All right, so what was the first question?
European
I got
Union.
so involved in the second question, I forgot the first
The
question.
European Union.
Oh, the
budget
European Union. How could I forget that? Okay, well, you know, as I said, I have high hopes for Europe. And that hasn't changed. I continue to regard Europe as the vanguard. It's, you know, when I go to Brussels, I feel like I'm going to a hallowed place. And of course, the people who live and work in Brussels feel like they are just so beleaguered and nothing, you know, nothing that they do matters, and it's just all uphill, and they're down there in the boiler room and just see it completely differently. Nevertheless, the work that has come out of Brussels I regard as heroic and courageous, and has set the line of the frontier in this space. Is it enough? No. Is GDPR enough? No. Is existing antitrust law enough? No. But we have strong shoulders to stand on.
No.
Is what?
Taxation.
Is taxation enough? No. Well, taxation has a lot of beauty in taxation. If used properly, with the boldness that you will inspire in your elected officials. We have some extraordinary people leading now in the EU. And there are recognized, going back to earlier theme, the recognized values of, EU leaders are not shy to talk about democracy and humanity as the guiding principles. And we're not quite there yet in the United States, although we are moving in that direction. So I have tremendous faith in the EU leadership right now. What's your name? Tristan?
Christoph.
Oh.
Christoph.
Christoph, I'm sorry. Christoph, I have tremendous faith in the EU leadership, tremendous hope. And, but I don't believe that they can do it alone. You need to give them cover. You need to drive them from behind. They need to know that they can depend on you. This symbiosis, this reciprocity is essential. Now, the second question. Look, when I write about instrumentarian power in the book, which you haven't read yet, mostly, I assume, I write about it from the point of view of the companies that have invented instrumentarian power regard it as a solution for a broken modernity. Modernity is broken because our institutions no longer serve us. Modernity is broken because we have not been able to address climate catastrophe. Modernity is broken because we feel ourselves to be individuals invested with the inalienable rights of individual, sovereign individuals, and yet everywhere we go in our lives, we feel powerless. So they offer instrumentarian power as a solution to this broken modernity. Computational governance replaces democracy. All we need are algorithms and algorithmic parameters. We don't need laws. We know what you're doing. If you go outside the parameter, burning too much carbon, we catch you and we punish you. And that's how life proceeds. The question is, Christoph, are we so broken that we are ready to accept this regime as our solution, as our future? The only way we can be energy efficient, the only way we can be climate respecting, the only way we can live together in equality and mutual respect, the only way we restore dignity to individuals is through algorithmic law and computational governance. I've staked everything that the answer to this is no. That democracy is the long best idea that has emerged from the human story. That people should be able to govern themselves. That so many from our families and other families have sacrificed for this idea. And that we would give it up for the ease and convenience and certainty without terror of instrumentarian power, that we would make that choice. I say no. I say we will not make that choice.
Hello, my name is Norbert, and I would like to know who was the most influential teacher for you? And as you are a teacher too, who was the student who most provoked your changing your line of thinking?
So maybe we make it a little shorter, so we can get the 2 or 3 questions that are still waiting.
Let me say this as far as my teachers. I had more than one extremely influential teacher. When I was a university student, I had illustrious professors who were extremely influential. But you know why? It's exactly what we were talking about before. I can remember being down on my hands and knees on the floor with a world-famous anthropologist, mapping our ideas on a huge piece of paper on the floor together. And both of us being so excited. I felt that my ideas mattered. He made me feel that. Do that. If you're a teacher, do that. If you're a parent, do that. As far as my students, I have to say, I know this is not the answer that you wanted, but I have to say my children. My children have been my most demanding students.
No, but you have to take this literally because you had your school at home. You were teaching them privately.
Yes, and we did homeschool for several years. And they question everything, and they force me to think and rethink so as not to just be a parent, an authority, but to be an alive, dynamic comrade, in their lives. this is my answer, for what it's worth.
Maybe I might add something if the question goes to intellectual guiding figures. You mentioned Hannah Arendt, which certainly is one, especially her totalitarianism analysis, but also a little bit surprising maybe for us Viennese, Karl Polanyi, whom you cite several times, and whose idea that something that shouldn't become a commodity became a commodity is central to your book.
Yes. I found myself, because of the parallelism that I spoke to you about before, totalitarianism emerging in the 30s, 40s, 50s, mid-century, unprecedented, and then the scholars who gathered to try and make sense of this and understand it. So while I was doing this work, trying to understand instrumentarian power, I found myself drawn to mid-century scholars from the 20th century who were immersed in this struggle of trying to understand totalitarianism and its consequences. So that, of course, begins with Arendt, but also the social psychologists like Stanley Milgram and Lewin, and just a whole range of these, brilliant, that first generation of social psychologists, Solomon Asch, many of them who were refugees who escaped Germany, and who spent their lives, trying to understand how could people have behaved this way, and to try and answer that question. So this whole body of work at mid-century really riveted me, but also the people at the beginning of the 20th century, like Durkheim and Weber, who were confronted with industrial society and the whole industrialization for the first time in the modern sense, and tried to make sense of it. And looking at their work and realizing that they were young, radical thinkers trying to make sense of something that had never before existed. And so that also inspired me a great deal.
My name is Ingrid, and I do have a question, sorry. In the United States, you have quite an interesting debate going on regarding the 2020 election. And many people, again, fear manipulation via social media. And so Jack Dorsey said that Twitter would not allow political ads anymore, which led to many, many questions. And Mark Zuckerberg said they want to keep political ads on their platform. And I wondered how you see this debate. I must say I find it fascinating that when you look at the United States, the dangers of micro-targeting are only discussed in a political field, and there is now this idea that you should forbid this type of advertisement when it comes to politics, but when it comes to commercial ads, it's non-existent, this debate. I find that fascinating, and I wondered what you think about that and what you think the United States should do in the current situation.
Ingrid is the author of a critical book on the internet that just came out.
Fantastic, congratulations. Well, look, this is precisely why I said to you what I did tonight, that this whole realm of political targeting is simply a parasite on the host, and the host is surveillance capitalism. That's where these capabilities were invented, and that's where they're used on a daily, hourly, second-by-second basis. And that's something that we need to appreciate and understand. If one is information warfare, it's all information warfare. Now, under democratic governance, what would we do? We would say, perhaps, within a 4-month zone of an election, political advertising is banned. Let's say that. When we have democratic governance, we can say these things. We can say if there's going to be political advertising, it has to be true. it cannot be false and be called political advertising. These are things that are, in a sense, common sense. If we have democratic governance and the platforms refuse to obey the law, then we shut down the platform. Not forever, but we have to assert democratic control, which means our control, so that the platforms operate in a way that is consistent with our aspirations as a democratic society. Right now, that is not true. And for Facebook to say, we will create our own court, and our court will decide, this is utterly intolerable. It must be democratic law, not Facebook law. Facebook law is not law. So this is the direction of my thinking. I understand that we have a ways to go before anybody's about to be that bold, but maybe not so far as we think. You know, when I was at the International Grand Committee hearings as a witness in Ottawa, when the Nancy Pelosi, you remember this? Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the House in the U.S. Congress. They did a fake video of Nancy Pelosi, so she was up there speaking and she looked like she was drunk. And Facebook kept it alive on the platform, getting all kinds of engagement, of course, very lucrative. And in the committee, Damien Collins, who's the parliamentarian from London, from the UK, insisted to the Facebook executives, how can you do this? This is a violation of democracy. This is an affront to every elected official. And all the Facebook executives could do was answer in one way and repeat that answer over and over and over. It does not violate our rules. It does not violate our rules. It does not violate our rules. Their rules serve them, not us. So we have to intervene and impose democratic governance.
Good evening, my name is Ralf Janik, and thanks for taking care of those on the worst seats. My question is, someone has to be the advocatus diaboli here now, so I do sense that you're somewhat preaching to the converted here, but when I've recently been to a conference and there was a Chinese delegate, and he said, well, we're experimenting, we're having an experiment, we want to know what our citizens want without elections. So you're now painting a dystopian picture here, but what about the utopian side to it? So we all know it's convenient, right? We travel, and then Google tells us whether the train is going to be crowded. When I open my checklist with students each Wednesday, Google knows that I open this document every day on Wednesday, 8 o'clock, so I don't even have to make a lot of clicks. So where do we draw the line between dystopia and utopia? Because you've now talked about dystopia, but at the same time, there are some positive aspects, and if we go out on the streets, I assume, and we ask people about everything you said or you wrote in your book, I mean, I'm only halfway through it, I admit it, but most of them would probably not say that it's inherently bad. So what is the bad aspects? Why are we having a problem with all of that? Isn't it making life more convenient? And I'm aware of the fact that I'm a bit of an advocatus diaboli here.
I'm going to repeat a little bit of what I said before, but in a different way. We deserve that information. We deserve the convenience. We deserve the services that enhance our lives, enhance our homes, enhance our health, enhance our cities. We deserve all of this. But we deserve it under our control. not under the control of private surveillance capital that does not have our interests at heart. So, what does Google do for us? I happen to have here a very expensive piece of advertising real estate. You know the magazine, The New Yorker? This is a very posh magazine in the United States. And this is the back cover of The New Yorker.
I think you have to turn it around. Oh, no, it's right. It's a right one, yeah.
All right, and what you can see is this says at the top, helping you, and at the bottom, Google. And there are 17 things that they say here. This is Google's sort of best shot on expensive real estate on how they help us. All right, there's 17 things here. So just so you don't think I'm biased, call out a number, and I'll tell you what that number is. Call out a number. 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Find a 4-letter word for assist. All right, give me another number. 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Leave on time. One more. 1. Name the 21st president. They're all the same. Cancel that meeting, move that meeting, take better pictures at night. Do the floss. Do you know what the floss is? Yeah, it's a dance. No, you're wrong, hon. I'm sorry. That's what I used to think. No. It's a dance. And I'm not even going to try to show you what it looks like. That's my daughter's department. All right. So, the point is, this is how they say they're improving our lives. It's all trivial. Big data, back in the early 2000s, when we saw these companies amassing unprecedented material infrastructure, capabilities, the last 20 years where they have essentially cornered the Earth's data scientists, so that universities in Europe and in the United States have to ration computer science courses because most of the computer scientists are going for multi-million-dollar salaries in the tech sector rather than working in academia or in cities or in governments, for that matter, state governments. Okay, so right at the beginning, information scholars said it's a really great thing that these companies are developing these huge infrastructures because they will be the ones who will figure out big data. The idea was they were going to figure out what's going on with climate and how do we come up with solutions for catastrophe. They were going to figure out the remedies and treatments for cancers. They were going to figure out how to eliminate all those plastic particles that we now find out are even in the Arctic snow. Instead, we have the best minds of their generation, the most vast and comprehensive, powerful material infrastructures, the greatest agglomerations of data ever conceived, all trained on the click stream. The science of the click stream, the science of human futures markets, the science of behavioral predictions. They are not serving us. Let us have the convenience. Let us have the big data. But let us have it under democracy so that it meets our real needs, so it meets society's real needs. Right now, surveillance capitalism is a market failure. It pretends to be successful, but despite what the hypothesis that you offered, sir, every single piece of research from the early 2000s, when you expose people to the backstage operations, they reject this stuff. They don't want to be enmeshed in these systems. They want an alternative. But the alternatives over these 20 years have been foreclosed. So, we continue. Yes, we take the convenience because we need it. We engage with the service because there's no other means of social participation. We are forced to march through these supply chains. But give us a real choice, the same goods and services with a real choice. I believe that just about everyone on planet Earth is ready to be a customer of an alternative. And there's a huge competitive playing field waiting to be opened up. As soon as we can take the incentives out of the surveillance dividend, and the way we do that, as we have been discussing, is through law.
Okay, shall we take one more question and then close the panel, please? That's the last question from you.
Thank you very much that you are personally here. I am allowed to speak German. You use some planet, last word. Planet means only a small zone of this Earth about 7 kilometers high. In this zone we are living all. Next is a human able with our Steinzeitgedächtnis, ja, oder Steinzeithirn.
Stone Age memory. Let me translate. You can speak German and I can try and translate it.
Okay. Sind wir mit unserem Steinzeithirn in der Lage, diese Herausforderung oder mit diesem Werkzeug der künstlichen Intelligenz fertig zu werden und es richtig zu benutzen?
Are we ready to use with our Stone Age brains artificial intelligence and use it accordingly?
Well, I could flip that around right now and say that it's the Stone Age part of our humanity that is most interested in driving artificial intelligence in the direction that we've been discussing. In other words, the state of nature, if we're going to Stone Age, the state of nature is a state where we fight one another for power over resources. And when we're developing AI outside of democratic constraints, constitutional governance, we're actually right now with AI in a state of nature where it's that will to power, that fight over resources that's driving companies to develop the most powerful. It's the reason why people like Peter Teil and other renowned surveillance capitalists want to remind us that artificial intelligence is really all about weaponry and fighting wars. So if we're going to use artificial intelligence intelligently to enhance our lives and enhance our world, it's going to be not out of our Stone Age self, not simply out of the will to power, but out of that part of our humanity that has created human rights and has created the elaborations of democracy. That's where this complexity belongs, in that higher part of our humanity, under its governance, under that regime. That's my answer.
Sie hörten die amerikanische Ökonomin Shoshana Zuboff im Gespräch mit dem Publikum und befragt von Falter-Herausgeber Armin Thurnher beim Wiener Stadtgespräch am 14. November 2019. Bei den Kolleginnen und Kollegen der AK Wien bedanke ich mich sehr herzlich für die Audiodatei zu dieser Folge. Ich verabschiede mich von allen Hörerinnen und Hörern, die uns auf UKW folgen, im Freirad Tirol und auf Radio Agora in Kärnten. Der Falter bietet jede Woche Neues und Kritisches auch aus der digitalen Welt. Wenn Sie informiert bleiben wollen, dann empfehle ich ein Abonnement des Falter. Als Weihnachtsgeschenke sind auch Geschenksabos möglich. Alle diese Bestellungen funktionieren auch über das Internet auf der Internetseite abo.falter.at. Ursula Winterauer hat die Signation gestaltet, Anna Goldenberg betreut die Technik. Ich verabschiede mich und bedanke mich für Ihr Interesse. Bis zur nächsten Folge.
Sie hörten das Falter-Radio, den Podcast mit Raimund Löw.